Hi again. Last week I was pleased to share with you that we reached the 20,000 downloads milestone. This week I'm excited to announce that according to Listen Notes, one of the world's biggest podcast search engines, The Voices of War is one of the top 3% most popular shows out of more than 2.7 million podcasts globally. To say that I'm excited about this would be an understatement, and I want to thank each and every one of you for supporting the show. If you haven't yet given us a 5-star rating or review, please consider taking a few seconds to maybe do that now. Every review and rating helps bring the show to more listeners. You can also help by telling your friends and family about the show, or simply by sharing it with your followers on social media. Okay, back to another interesting interview, this time with two outstanding guests. My guests today are John Blaxland and Chindu Zhu. My audience might already be familiar with John Blaxland, who's previously been on the show. He is a professor of international security and intelligence studies and former head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Prior to his academic pursuits, John enjoyed an extensive career as an intelligence officer in the Australian Army, including as the Principal Intelligence Staff Officer for the Australian contingent deployed to East Timor in 1999, as the Director Joint Intelligence Operations at Headquarters Joint Operations Command, and as Australia's Defence Attaché to Thailand and Myanmar. John is an outspoken commentator and researcher on topics such as Australian military history and strategy, public policy, security, defence and international relations. Chindu Zhu hosts Dialogue Weekend at China Global Television Network, a talk show that offers in-depth analyses of current affairs. He also works as a producer of the Today Show at China Radio International. As a political analyst who follows Chinese foreign policy closely, Chindu frequently contributes to international media outlets such as the New York Times, Press TV, NPR, Turkish TRT, ABC, RT, and others. Chindu majored in both English and international studies. His focus of research has been on China's rise and its interaction with the rest of the world. Chindu has spent years in the US as the chief correspondent for China Radio International and 1 year in Australia as a visiting scholar at the University of Melbourne. He is a senior fellow at the Pangol Institution and an adjunct professor at Renmin University of China. Chindu and John join me today to discuss the impact of the recently announced AUKUS security partnership, as well as broader issues to do with the ongoing rise of China. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me on The Voices of War.
Thank you, Maz.
Good to be with you, Maz.
John, maybe I can start with you. What is AUKUS and what has motivated its creation and, of course, the storm that ensued?
Yeah, thanks, Maz. Firstly, it's not a pact. It's a technical agreement about the sharing of technology, including nuclear propulsion for submarines. I was in a chat just recently, and people were talking about it, the AUKUS Pact. I'm thinking, hang on a minute. There's no security guarantee here. There's no reciprocal mutual agreement to protect each other in extremis. It's a technical agreement. Now, what it does is, imply that there's more to it, but it is in the words, in the black and white words used, it's a technical agreement. And why has it come about? Well, there's a variety of factors there. One is that technology has shifted. So the decision 5 years ago to get conventionally propulsion submarines with diesel-electric submarine propulsion has been overtaken by events. One is technology has shifted. What's become patently clear is that Australian submarines to operate at long distances, which is what you need to even just get around Australia's shoreline, let alone go anywhere else, requires the ability to sustain reasonably rapid movement with stealth. Now, submarines, the key thing about submarines is they offer stealth, but stealth has become compromised by the fact that computers, AI, drones, satellites means it's a lot easier to detect a submarine now than it ever was. It's particularly a conventionally powered one like the ones we were talking about getting from France. So the whole point of being stealthy, the whole point of spending 90 billion Australian dollars on submarines was to get something that had reach, deterrence, and stealth. If you don't have the stealth anymore, you don't have the deterrence. So it became an issue of, well, what do we do? We're in a bit of a conundrum. And the decision was made to approach the Brits and the Americans about sharing nuclear propulsion technology, and with that, a range of technologies that would enable Australia to be able to have greater range with its weapon systems, to add a degree of confidence to its ability to deter, mindful in particular of the fact that China has exponentially grown its military capabilities and developed long-range precision strike capabilities to which Australia could offer nothing to deter in response. So combination of factors there. And along the way, we managed to insult the French by walking away from the French submarine deal, even though they themselves made nuclear propulsion submarines. But their version was one it's a low enriched uranium version. The American British one is a high enriched uranium version, which ostensibly is a version that doesn't require massive Australian technological input because it's a bit like a black box. You can plug it in and run it for 30 to 35 years, and apart from exterior maintenance, not touch the insides. Now, that's all well and good in theory. The practice is that we now have cancelled a submarine program. We don't have another one. And so technologically, there's actually very little to show for it today
in
or
the
tomorrow.
near term. Yeah.
In the near term.
In the near term, of course. And now, of course, that's, and I like the fact that you use the word deterrent, because it's for even the very uninformed, it's very clear what this deterrence is for. And of course, the rise of China. Chindu, what are your thoughts on AUKUS and its origins and why it's been brought into existence?
Well, for China, if of course China is not happy with the new development, basically it's like a new military building block in this region. So, and also I want to point out, China's unhappiness is mostly targeting at Washington, not really at Australia, because China would say, if you look at the spokesperson from Chinese Foreign Ministry, they are talking about irresponsible behavior of Washington. Speak of being irresponsible, that means like there's a potential problem with non-proliferation treaty, because Australia is a member of NPT, but Washington, by exploring loophole in that NPT, basically by sharing technology with nuclear technology with Australia, because that could set a bad example for other countries. For example, South Korea, Iran, Israel, and Japan even. How do you have this enough reason or enough justification to prevent them from acquiring, for example, nuclear-powered submarines? They say, Australia has it. Why can't I have that? And also, that is a concern. And of course, by building such a new military alliance, it is, is breaking this security framework in this region. We know in this region, we have ASEAN at the center. Basically, we have all kinds of conferences like ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, foreign minister meeting, etc. Basically focusing on ASEAN or led by ASEAN countries, the 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, China, Europe, the United States, all part of this larger group. And you can say, adding to that is, from this year early on, the first summit meeting by President Biden is to have a video conference with leaders from other Quad countries, right, including Australia, India, and Japan. And now you have a AUKUS. Basically, on one hand, you enhanced the mechanism of Quad. We know that's also targeting China. And now you have AUKUS, again, targeting China. So Biden said at the UN General Assembly that, the U.S. is not seeking a Cold War or, somehow breaking the world into different blocks. But Washington is exactly doing that. So people wonder, is Washington seeking a new Cold War? That is a concern because for China does not want to have a Cold War with the U.S. or any other country, because China is still in the mind of pushing forward for example, this free trade agreement. That's why China applied to join CPTPP, the comprehensive and progressive TPP, and also RCEP is to start hopefully this year, at end of this year or early next year, to become effective. So China thinks, globalization, free trade, investment should still be the major theme of the global development, because that will benefit, of course, China and also the entire region, because that's about the people's standard of living, economic issues. We know that for every country that matters the most, probably. So that's the the differences. I think sitting from Beijing, people see it differently from the people in Canberra or in Washington.
Yeah,
can I respond,
Maz? Of course, John. Yeah, of course.
Because it's really great to hear Chindu's points of view on this, but there's so many points at which I have to respond. Now, firstly, rhetorically, all of the things Chindu said are, understandable and reasonably valid, but yet the reality doesn't quite match the rhetoric, because China has, we talk about a Cold War, we talk about an arms race. No other country in Asia has seen an exponential growth in its military capabilities other than China in the last 50 years. It is only China that has massively increased its spending and its investment in technology. It's built this, a fleet the size of the French Navy, arguably between one and a couple of years. It invested enormously in technologies that are deeply frightening and that have generated the pushback that have caused this concern. So is it targeting China? In part, it is a response to China's very, dramatic increase in its own defense capabilities, that when you match it to the rhetoric of wolf warrior diplomacy and the exercise of sharp power, the sanctions that the Koreans have suffered, the Canadians have suffered, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and now Australia have all been the butt of, it's deeply worrying. Now, Chindu talked about the United States seeking a new Cold War. I actually find that construct completely unhelpful. The Cold War was between two very separate political and economic powers, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. China was not part of that after 1971 anyway. It was very much a closed-off world, very little trade really between them, very little connection between them. They were isolated literally the Iron Curtain, as they used to call it. Today, the world is much more interconnected. So the metaphor of the Cold War I find helpful. What we're facing today is now what I'm calling the 6 seas in the one sea. The one global lake, which we all share, the global maritime commons, which if you flat out and out on a map, realise that, it is one lake that we all have to share, the level of which might be rising and causing global climate change concerns. Nonetheless, what we're seeing is a continuum from cooperation to competition to contestation, coercion, and conflict. Now, that's happening now. It's happening on a range of issues. And there is a range of responses that countries across the region, Southeast Asia, the Quad countries and beyond in Europe and elsewhere, are responding incrementally with some nuance on all of those issues. So it's very interesting to see China wanting to play in the CPTPP, and they're bought in on the RCEP. Great. Australia's got a free trade agreement with China, and we'll see whether with these World Trade Organization negotiations, China will honour its agreement to that, because it's imposed all these sanctions on Australia, economic and trade sanctions, that are clearly out of pique. They're clearly a response out of being annoyed at the gall of Australia challenging China over, the origins of the virus, the coronavirus, and Australia's objections to Huawei, which, Chinese legislation makes clear has implications in terms of Australia's domestic security. So, yes, it's great. China wants to join CPTPP. I would say okay, let's just check out on the ground rules here first. Who's included? What are the terms of reference? And are you going to lift the sanctions that you're imposing on Australia that are purely arbitrary? And also, is Taiwan going to be admitted at the same time? Much like we have with the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, it's between economies. And I think, if we're going to do that, I think the United States should be strongly encouraged to participate as well. If we want a level playing field, we do not want a playing field where we become beholden to an authoritarian state that under President Xi, despite our best wishes and our best intentions for our relationship in the past, has proven far more assertive, far more authoritarian, far more challenging than we had anticipated. And the wolf warrior diplomacy points to a gravely chilling dimension to China's finding its way with its great growing power. That's deeply unsettling. And while our neighbours may be relatively mute, some of them are quite mute about how strongly they support AUKUS or how deeply they disagree with AUKUS, the bottom line is that all of them are equally unnerved by wolf warrior diplomacy and sharp power. All of us are uneasy and uncomfortable and really want to see a change. We want China. We want trade with China. Nobody wants to stop that. We want China to be a player, but we're deeply unsettled by the manifestation of this authoritarian government under the current government of President Xi.
In the interest of fairness, though, as well, John, it could be construed certainly from the Chinese perspective that it's an action reaction. Where did this start? And I'll maybe ask you, Chindu, to maybe comment on that from the Chinese perspective, because it strikes me as though, the old saying, there are always three sides to a story, yours, mine, and the truth. And that strikes me as particularly important in this context, but also exceptionally important for the whole world because the risk posed by this are so tremendous. So maybe your thoughts on the Chinese perspective.
Yes, this is a big topic, Maz. It takes a lot of time probably to pay attention to this nuanced position, nuanced differences among countries. For example, when I was in Australia, I miss Australia, I miss Melbourne, the coffee. Like 2015, 2016, when I left, and then 2017, I found the media, I still pay attention to that. There's a hysteria about Chinese political interference, Chinese spying, Chinese students, Chinese, Confucius institutes. Everything in China is put and a negative light, like China is threatening Australia's economy, technology, or security. From Chinese point of view, I feel puzzled. Because if you ask anyone today, even today, on the streets of Beijing or Shanghai, what's your impression of Australia? 9 out of 10, I can assure you, people would say, oh, I have a good impression about Australia. Beautiful beach, nice people, good place for further education, doing trade, immigration or investment. That's the impression, basically. So when people talked about China threatening Australia or Chinese missile, could reach Sydney, as reported in some of the local media, I was amused. Talking to a friend at that time, I said, "Oh, you see, look at the coverage. They have a clause describing the Chinese DF-21. They say which could reach Sydney." I said, unless China is crazy, we will never think of firing the missile toward Australia, because for Chinese people, Australia is never the rival, not to mention the enemy or a country with hostility toward China. But with that being said, we do have our problems. For example, I would say mostly is this kind of concern or fear on Australian side, or the lack of understanding or misunderstanding about China, about China's political system, about Chinese culture, about China growing rapidly, whether China, is growing big and big, like we are living this under the shadow of China, what will China do to us? How big a threat China will become to us if we don't listen to them, for example. things like that. Some of that justified probably, in particular after this economic measures taken by Beijing. That does not help probably. And again, I would say, for people also see that, except for economic matters, on security issue, Australia appears to be an extension of Washington's foreign policy. That is the understanding, but that's okay. People would say that's all right. We are doing business with Australia. That's fine. Because we are not an enemy of the United States. We don't see the U.S. as an enemy of China. That's all right. U.S. having war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other places, but that's fine. We don't agree with that, but that's okay. So when Australia, in 2017, this all kinds of negative coverage, but with little substantial evidence about the Chinese, interference in the internal affairs of Australia. For me, because China has a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, mostly because China does not welcome other countries to interfere in its internal affairs, remember. So it has a strict policy of not to get involved in the domestic affairs of another country. So, when people say that, I would say, no, it's not the case. China would hate to intervene in the Australian politics, like election, like the foreign policy. Yeah, China would love Australia to have a more friendly policy toward China. Obviously, every country would love to have that, right? That's understandable, but they would not do something to intervene. And also in 2018, after this very negative coverage, very negative discussion about China, and then in 2018, Huawei was kicked out of the Australian market. Remember, Australia is the first country to kick Huawei out of their 5G network. That is I would say that is very negative in terms of the effects on the Chinese. It was not widely covered, despite this being the first, Australia being the first country, because people still think, probably that's fine. Other countries will still use Huawei. But of course, what we know later on, there's a economic war or trade war launched by Trump against China. Then Huawei becomes one of the top issue in this disputes between China and the U.S. So Huawei was put under severe sanction by the U.S. and the U.S. also put, I would say, tremendous pressure on its allies, basically to refuse Huawei to enter into their market. That's unfair. You can say that. Of course, that is the case. But plus Huawei and plus a lot of negative, this is I would say sentiment inside Australia, and then you have this Australian calling for the investigation of the origin of the pandemic of the virus over there. John also said that many people say that's because of Australia being the first country calling for international investigation of the origin of the virus. So China retaliated against Australia. I would say, no, it's not the case. It's an accumulation of a series of issues. For example, restriction of Chinese investment. For example, canceling of contracts between the two countries. Things like that. You can see the relationship or the trust is somehow being, losing between the two countries. And then, China took measures against Australia, economic measures, of course. And so we see the relationship getting worse and worse, unfortunately. But overall, the Chinese side, I would say, they still see Australia as a very important trading partner. I would say, China's application to join CPTPP actually provides an opportunity for the two countries to fix their relationship. For example, Australian side, of course, will talk to the Chinese side. If you want to join CPTPP, we should solve our problems first, and then we can talk about other conditions. Example. So I think there is this factors for the two countries to actually use that as an opportunity to fix the problem and improve their relationship and improve the trust. between the two countries. When John talked about China's military development, can I respond a little bit to that too?
Yeah, please.
Because there's a lot of points over there.
No, I totally understand that. Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Yeah, the military development, many people would say, Chinese military development is threatening. I would agree China's rapid military development. I would say that's the fact, and no deny about that. But again, we should take that into perspective. For example, China's rapid economic development. China is the second largest economy, and naturally, it will spend a certain percentage of its GDP on defense, just like every country does. So 1.7% of its defense spending, that's a lot of money. If you compare that to the US, it's about 3.7% of the GDP on military spending. I think China spends in percentage-wise is lower than Korea, than Vietnam. I think lower than Australia. Australia is probably a 2.1% of GDP on military spending. For China, the security concern, on one hand, that's natural development. I would argue, country develops economy, you have your interest to protect. For example, one belt, one road. China has its interests in every corner of the world today, but China is not building military posts everywhere around the world like the US does, to protect its interests, because China does not believe in, that's the best choice to protect its interests. But why, you would ask, why China is still building its military? I would say it's mostly periphery security. For example, Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue. That's the most concern. Remember, China has the neighboring countries on border, like 14 countries, and then you have neighboring countries overseas, like Japan, South Korea, etc., and Southeast Asian countries. So there's a security issue. I would say mostly it's really about the US. It's not about Australia. It's not about the UK or France or Germany. No, because the US would say they would do everything to defend Taiwan in the event of a war. So, for the Chinese side, what would you do? Let's put the sovereignty issue aside a little bit. As a big country, as a country with a strong tradition of unification of the country in terms of territorial integrity, of a country with a strong tradition of independence. So they would say, we don't rely on Russia. We don't rely on any other country. We would rely on ourselves and to protect ourselves. If you look at the development, it's really about, some would say deterring, tools of weapons. Basically, they call it, they want to use the weapon to prevent the U.S. involvement in the cross-strait relationship. In the event of a war, if Taiwan declares independence today, most likely there will be a military conflict. And then, of course, that's a test for China, that's a test for Washington, but you always prepare for the worst. So in that sense, I would say, Chinese military development, no, it's not for Australia. It's not targeting at any other country, but mostly I would say the China-US relationship.
John, any...
Fantastic, Qingduo.
Yeah.
No, look, Maz, this is really fascinating. Grist for the mill. I'm really glad to hear all this. Very interesting, your chronology, Qingduo, and I appreciate you outlining it. I think, between us, it's the comparing and contrasting, you're right. And Maz, you made the point earlier about there being three perspectives.
Yeah.
I think you're probably right, because I've got another perspective, and I look back to 2017. Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister of Australia. This is the man who was pushing the free trade agreement with China, was speaking up the positives of the relationship with China, had nothing but positive things to say about the relationship with China. Launched Hugh White's publication, his book on the China issues. Can't remember exactly. It wasn't the China choice. It was his next one. He's written a few on the same kind of permutations of the same kind of issue. Malcolm Turnbull happily launched it. He was sympathetic and, got the sense that this is all well and good. And yet things really started to change. When he became Prime Minister, he started getting briefed in on a range of things that were happening. The foreign interference that Chindor touched on, the espionage, the attempts to buy off people like Sam Dastyari, which blew up in Sam's face and really brought to mind the issue of foreign interference. The ASIO annual reports have been featuring this for a number of years now, but they really started to spike from about 2015, 16, 17 onwards. The Confucius Institutes became very closely associated with a policy straitjacket that basically you had to conform with a PRC political perspective on the Chinese history and Chinese culture, which became, for liberal institutions like the Australian National University, where I belong, it was intolerable. That's not the way we operate. We don't get told how to think or how to research or to teach. So that all of those kind of issues really, Chindor said there's little evidence. Well, there's actually a fair amount of evidence, actually. It's cumulatively. There's enough stuff there. And then along the way, Australia started pushing back on Huawei. And yes, there's probably a degree of cross-checking of notes with the United States, but people need to appreciate Australia's enormously invested in its security relationship with the United States. The United States matters to Australia enormously, has done since 1941, 42, and probably will do. We just commemorated 70 years of the ANZUS alliance. It's a piece of paper, 800 words long, an essay. It is now just the trellis upon which many other bilateral and multilateral relationships are built that are incredibly important to Australia, fundamentally important to Australia's sense of its place in the world, in an attempt to reconcile Australia's fear of abandonment and its fear of entrapment. It's come down on the view that it needs to support the United States. Now, at the same time, though, and there's a really interesting book written by one of our people, was recently at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, Shannon Tao, called Independent Ally. Australia makes its policy decisions on its own estimation of its own interests, and they happen to quite often align with its perception of the interests of the United States. And very interestingly, that China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has really come out talking in a way that is, been very, very critical of Australia, and that's generated considerable pushback. On Huawei, I think it's just worth making the point that it really was an assessment made on the prospects of a system that was potentially going to be very dominant and exert undue, disproportionate influence on Australian politics and on Australian ability to operate independently if it was to allow Huawei to get its way. And essentially the technology, it's now reasonably well understood that 5G technology, the barriers that were available for 3 and 4G technology to protect parts of the core infrastructure that were seen as part of national security infrastructure are much less able to be secured particularly if you're going to adopt Huawei technology. So that was then in 2020, as Chingdu pointed out, the COVID investigation, China sought to retaliate as a response to an accumulation of the issues. There's no question in my mind, Australia handled that pretty darn clumsily. We could have done better, but it wasn't invalid. What surprises me, Chindor, why didn't President Xi take this and flip it and say, you know what, Australia, you're absolutely right. We are going to take the lead in investigating this completely transparently and thoroughly, and we're going to prove to the world that we are the responsible agent that is actually going to make sure that there is never a repeat of the COVID virus. We are going to lead the world in making sure that we, the global community, will never suffer a pandemic like this again.
Maybe that's a good question to ask. Why would that not have happened, Chindu?
This is a good question. Looking back, for what happened between China and Australia, for example, I would say both countries can or could have handled their relationship in a better way,
Absolutely.
step back a little bit, and have more trust and talk to each other. We could have done a better job at maintaining a strong trust, a strong relationship between the two countries. In that, and then we would have security guaranteed. There's no fear about each other. As for the specific question, I think, there's remember, John, at that time, Donald Trump was still there. There was a lot of talk in the United States. They say, China should compensate for the loss of, people's life, for the loss of the medical expenses. People talk about trillions of dollars China should pay, for not only for the U.S., probably for the entire world. That would mean the end of China. So there is a serious concern in Beijing. People would say, "Oh gosh, if we cooperate in a more cooperative manner to deal with the issue, somehow you would admit, yes, it's our fault. Yeah, it's origin is in Wuhan, it's in China, and that kind of environment, the international environment, make things somehow very difficult to handle. When Australia stood out and calling for the investigation, if on a second level, I would say, if China say, "Oh, Australia was right, we should do this," it's like, China is following the Australia, for big powers, for big countries. Yeah. China would say, "No problem. If WHO is calling for investigation, China fully cooperate with WHO, but probably not with any other individual country, including the US."
And this highlights an issue, right? Again, it's I think nation level confirmation bias comes into play. Every nation undoubtedly can find examples where the other nation had done something wrong. To tie in John's points about Huawei, in fact, I just recently published a paper on some of the gray zone warfare concerns from countries like Russia, China, and so on. So there's ample examples. I have absolutely no doubt then China and Russia can find examples of the Western nations, including Australia, playing in their sovereign, what they perceive to be their sovereign space, whether in the digital domain or even, on their home soil. I have absolutely no doubt that every side can do that. And therein lies the issue. I wonder is if a lot of this, in fact, I'm sure it is, a lot of this rhetoric that we're hearing is for domestic audiences. Because it's certainly for Australia. As you said, China doesn't consider Australia to be a threat. In fact, it's to do with the US. Australia has, of course, sided with the US, and that's for many reasons, as John identified. That's not a surprise, and like you said, China's has no concern about that. But how much risk are we exposing the world to by these rhetorics that are really for the domestic audience? Because China can't, like you just said, China couldn't admit Wuhan, origin of virus investigation, etc., because it couldn't be perceived as weak domestically, probably mostly to protect its own survival, I guess, particularly not by a country that is seen as a middle-level country like Australia. So where do we go from here? Because it strikes me as though this is there is no, how do we steer the ship, basically? Because the domestic audiences require every individual country to assert dominance, to show that they're powerful. Otherwise, they face risk domestically, whether in a democratic system or in the CCP.
So my sense is that this reveals a degree of, and Chindua's comments touched on this, a degree of nervousness and vulnerability domestically on the Chinese front that I think is understandable. And I like to say, everybody loves a good set of double standards. Everybody likes a set of standards for them and a set of standards for someone else, for the others. And that applies in international relations as well. We all like to point out the faults of the other and never like to admit our own. And Australia is as guilty of this as everybody else. We're all as bad as each other. I mean, I think it's helpful if we admit that to each other, to ourselves 100%. At least, if we're honest with ourselves about that. And I think, I like what Chindu said. We need to be thinking about ways to extricating ourselves from this corner we found ourselves in. We don't want things to get worse. We want things to get better. But I think it's important for us to be realistic about what we're facing. And I think it's important to think, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, particularly about the military spending of China and China's economic vulnerability. It is spending 1.7% of its GDP, apparently. And I'm not sure if the figures are accurate. I mean, we don't have great transparency. In Australia, we have defence white papers. We have really very outspoken, open, declaratory policy, making very clear about how we spend our money and the reasons we spend our money the way we do. China is much more opaque about that. And it would be very helpful, in my view, if China was more transparent about its funding and its intentions. Now, thinking about intentions, I think, I'm a historian, I love history, right? And I think there's a bit of a parallel. There's limits to the parallel, but humor me for a moment. I think there's a parallel between the emergence of China in the 21st century and the emergence of the British Empire. And Britain experienced the Industrial Revolution. It had coal. It had the inventions of steam engines. And it then developed, it needed markets and it needed raw materials. So it started expanding its empire for markets and raw materials. And then it needed security for the East India companies, etc., those corporations that were semi-state corporations. Sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? That actually needed security, and then they needed governance. So when Francis Drake, explored the ocean, there was no manifesto for British domination of the world. It happened incrementally, and it happened over a couple hundred years. Now, I think what we're seeing is China's emergence as an empire on steroids. Now, there's no manifesto, there's no declaration for Chinese domination of the world. It's a manifestation of the trade, of the economic dynamics. It needs raw materials, it needs markets, it needs security of supply. It's worried about the Malacca Strait, understandably. It's got a very small exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it wants to expand in the South China Sea, and it wants to buy up islands in the South Pacific like Kiribati. Perfectly understandable on one level. But we need to be clear about what's going on. And I think while there is no manifesto of Chinese global domination, there is a fear, particularly in light of President Xi's very opaque management of an increasingly authoritarian state with a massive increase in defence spending. This is generating enormous nerves globally, which is why you're seeing Britain playing in Asia, the German frigate coming to Australia, the Dutch playing, the Canadians now talking about playing in the Indo-Pacific. All of these countries and bodies, the French, of course, have been here for a while, ages. All of these now talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. Why? Because they've got nervous. In my view, it's a nervousness that China could dispel if it chose to behave differently, if it chose to be more transparent and more open in its approach to society. And of course, here the Taiwan question comes in, because Taiwan is a humiliating demonstration of what an open democracy with Chinese characteristics looks like. And unfortunately, the handling of Hong Kong, where the one country, two systems was at work for nearly 3 decades now, the cancellation of one country, two systems has sent a powerful and chilling message to Taiwan and to Japan and to the region that China is not going to tolerate anything else. And that means that Taiwan, this beacon of democracy, this country that actually is an economic dynamo in and of its own right, country, the population of Australia, it's enormously economically dynamic. It is now it is kind of by example showing up at Xi and Xi's China. And it seems such a shame to me that Xi doesn't take this and flip it, much like I tried to say we should flip the whole COVID thing. Why doesn't Xi flip this and say, hey, you know what? We realize that the greater path for, the dialectic of communism is actually probably, if we rebadge it, I mean, they've rebadged communism half a dozen times already. But let's face it, it doesn't look anything like what Chairman Mao talked about. Let's rebadge it and make it look a bit like Taiwanese democracy. I mean, even within the one-party state, allow for some democracy in the one-party state. You call it the parties within the party. I don't know. There's ways you can skin this cat differently that can allay fears. But of course, maybe Chindu can enlighten us more. My sense is perhaps one of the reasons why that doesn't happen is because President Xi is actually more nervous than he's letting on. But one other point just about the spending on defence. The United States was instrumental in inviting China into the World Trade Organization. It is now spending to compete with the United States. I think that's a real travesty. That's a shame. Japan never felt it needed to compete with the United States. When it was the top dog in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when everyone was worried in the United States was worried about Japan, Japan did not boost its spending beyond 1% of GDP, even though it probably could have. My sense, it's a real shame that China is not viewing this as a partnership, rather than seeing this as a competition, a contestation, and a conflict. That it not look to see this more as a more like a sporting competition rather than a war. Let's say if we use the metaphor, this is why I'm thinking that continuum is useful to think of in a positive way, and which is why I'm actually pretty upbeat about the Quad. The Quad, it's so in coming out of Wang Yi's office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, you hear about it in very dark Manichaean terms. I'm thinking, hang on a minute. This is good. Competition is good, Getting India to look beyond itself and actually invest in vaccines in the Pacific. Why is that bad? That's not bad. That's good, Getting Australia and India to cooperate. We've been trying to do that for decades, for generations. That's good, right? Engaging with Japan is good. It's actually good. And Japan's got good relations, relatively good relations with everybody. It wants to have better relationships with China. And let's not forget, Japan is the country, a colleague of mine, Amy King, did her thesis, a PhD thesis, was on the investment in Japan made in China in the acts of reparation, as much as anything, in the 50s, 60s and 70s, that Japan did in a quite generous way, with self-interest in mind, of course, everybody does. But China has kind of erased that from its history. And now, why? Why did you bother erasing? That's a really good. There's some good things happening between China and Japan.
Maybe we'll let Chindu respond to some of those questions because I can see him nodding.
A lot.
Yeah. And again, gentlemen, I'm conscious. I'm very conscious of these are all big topics, and time.
There's a lot John mentioned. Yeah. Let me respond a little bit to China, Japan, mostly about the Diaoyu Islands. Of course, there's a Japanese name for it. Interestingly, the controversy developed, I think, in 2012 or even earlier. Around that time, the opposition party of Japan came to power. The opposition party, interestingly, actually has a good relationship with China. But unfortunately, they had no experience of handling domestic and foreign affairs. And they somehow, received an advice to nationalize the Diaoyu Islands. And then they think that would be easier to handle the relationship with China. But on the Chinese point of view is nationalize the Diaoyu Islands. That means, that's a formal announcement of Diaoyu Islands belonging to Japan. That's part of Japan. So that's a change of status quo, which is, there's a dispute, but we don't touch upon that. Japan can claim that's part of Japan. China can claim that's part of China. But, that's a thorny issue. Let's leave it aside and focus on our cooperation. But with the declaration of nationalization of that, islands, it changed the status quo, and then it incites a strong response from the Chinese side. And then we see the worsening of the relationship between the two countries. I would say that's very unfortunate. They should have handled it much better way. But anyway, that's China, Japan. Let's respond a little bit to John, what John said about the China-US, competition. I see that there's an expectation, China could become the second Japan, largely following the lead of the US and be part of the mostly West-dominated international system. I would say for most of the part of the time, China was, I would say, in that case, in WTO, in the international organization, IMF, World Bank, China is part of that, working with Western countries. There are some disputes, but that's okay. People can manage, that differences. But as China continue to grow, I would say then there's an issue. That's realists in the US would say fundamentally it's about they would call it a structural issue because there's only one country could be at the top. With China continuing to grow, China's growth itself is a challenge to the US primacy, international primacy. Remember the trade war. Trade war was launched by Donald Trump, was not launched by China. People tend to say, China-US trade war, China-US tech war, China-US, this war and that war. China would love to sit down to talk to the US side and solve the problem instead of having that kind of, basically tariffs on products and services from another country, because neither country can benefit from that kind of practice. But anyway, that is the case. Now today, Biden administration is talking about fierce competition with China. Chinese people would ask the question, competing for what? China is not competing with the United States. Can we say, John also said competition is good. Competition in technology is good. I would say we should be open and see, which country can, do better in R&D, ultimately that will help the human being. All of us would benefit from the advancement in the US technology or the advancement in China technology. I would say partly because of the lack of trust between the two countries, partly because of the, since 2015, actually, if I'm not wrong, there's a big debate inside the US whether our engagement policy with China has failed, in the sense of China is not becoming a Western-style democracy. So people would say, we failed. We failed to change China into a democracy. I would say, why would you want to change China into a Western democracy? And then, it's a philosophical issue. People would talk about different political system, which system works better. I'll give that. I think China has a lot to catch on in terms of openness, in terms of market access, in terms of transparency, in terms of being, more free, I would say. China could do a lot in that respect because ultimately that will benefit China. I studied in Australia. I know Australia is a very open society, is a very free society. And that's probably also explains why people are afraid of, once you have this sense, China is somehow probably not our friend. And then you have a focus on the Chinese activity. And then you see everything is wrong. Actually, Chinese involvement or Chinese investment in Australia is tiny compared to the investment from United States, from the UK, even from, I think, Netherlands. So people see, Chinese investment is like a monster. No, it's a very small amount of Chinese investment. I think it's a perception. Perception matters, unfortunately. If you have such a negative perception, then everything about China is somehow being seen in a negative light. That's a very unfortunate, I would say. And also, for China is not competing with the US for global dominance. I know, but with that said, I understand the concern, the nervousness of countries like Australia, like the UK, probably European countries too, or our neighboring countries. Chinese people sometimes, I would say, not sensitive to that, not sensitive enough to that. We would say, China is still a developing country. China is still far away from being a rich country. In particular, in terms of per capita GDP, China is about I think ranks the 80th somewhere around the world. So it's still in the middle. So China, people would say, we still have a long way to go. People don't see their progress as something really impressive as seen from overseas. So there's this discrepancy between the perception, and people are not sensitive enough to our neighboring countries' concern about our behavior, about our policy, about our rhetoric even. Our politicians or our spokesperson, if you say something, there's impact because you are a big country, right? So I think in that sense, China should learn to improve in that respect, because China is not a big power, and now it's becoming a bigger power, and somehow, is not mature enough I would say it's not sophisticated enough in communicating with the outside world, including countries like Australia. We could do a good job in that sense. So that's part of the issue.
Can I just pick up on something there that you said, Chindu, because I think it actually speaks to another point and a thought that pops up. I recently read a really good book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, about the impact of culture and why certain cultures that are tight, like China, tight in the sense that they have strict norms and rules, as opposed to countries like Australia that are loose, where just about everything goes and we're open, transparent, etc. It comes down to ultimately pressures and survival. It's a book by Michel Gelfand, a very prominent researcher in the field of culture. And another one that also springs to mind, just recently interviewed Douglas Fields, who wrote another really great book, Why We Snap, and he's provided 9 neurological triggers that exist both individually and in societies, why countries respond in certain ways. And I just want to bring in one point here and I want to ask you, what do you think? It strikes me as though we in the West don't necessarily give enough credence to the insult China perceives from its growth, from its past. And of course, here we can bring in the century of humiliation, just the rhetoric of that. Has deep emotional ties. And same, China perhaps doesn't understand how the Western world sees the global world order, whatever you want to call it, the established world order, is being threatened. And all of these are triggers for emotional outbursts and non-rational responses. What are your thoughts on that? And I'll maybe go to Chindu first, and then we'll go to John.
That's a good point, Maz. Interesting point, I would say. Yes, I would say culturally, tradition and also history, do play a very important part in every country, in our perception about the outside world, about our relationship with other countries. For example, for China, people do, history is relevant. It's still relevant. History, people, that's a particular...
Couldn't agree more, Chindu.
Yeah, that explains, people why, Chinese people, obviously, including the governments, they are very sensitive, to being treated in a, unequal way, in a way of lack of respect. They perceive, So if they see that as respect or disrespect, they would probably respond in a negative way. If they see, they are treated with equality, with respect, usually there's a nice response. I think it's not only China. If you look at the mostly developing countries, a lot of countries, once colonized by the UK or France, in general, people are very sensitive to how they are being treated, how they are being seen. If you talk to people from African countries, even Indians included. So I agree. I think, there is a point. Now, with China's development, people would say people are becoming more confident. People would love to see, probably, they would say, we are equal, so we can do things in a way we can start with each other in a more equal manner. But of course, we know today's world is still dominated by the US and the West at large in general. And then, people sometimes will see, these things or that matter is not dealt with in an equal way, in an equal manner. And then I would say, naturally, there will be some issues, some differences between China and the US, for example, in that sense. And so for the, the crisis, the pandemic crisis somehow, created this big problem for people to mingle with each other, to visit each other, and for scholars to talk to each other and to share our, what do you think about this issue on that issue? We should communicate more and understand the other side. In that way, we can better deal with our relationship, Sometimes we don't understand why you are thinking in that way, why you do things in that manner, Like often there's obviously rationale, there's explanation we need to understand. I don't think China is in a position like, being described as aggressive, offensive, assertive, or trying to somehow, start disputes with other countries. No, China's primary focus is a domestic issue. That's why Chinese government stress so much about stability, because our history tells us if there's a chaos, with a population of 1.4 billion people, that would be a big, big trouble for the entire nation. So stability, that's why they stress so much about norms, about the order, and that also explains, China compared with Western society in general, they're different in a sense. But when it comes to, I would say, if you go deeper to the heart, you would see we are more or less the same. People are friendly, people are nice to each other. If you look at Australian people, Chinese people, they're good friends. I have a lot of friends in Australia. Similarly, I believe John has friends in China too. We need to somehow to strengthen the understanding and to reduce the misunderstanding, the mistrust. And with that being said, I would say China-US, I tend to agree there's a big issue that is, how to deal with this relationship. If China continues to grow, and it continues to grow now, how will the US deal with another country, which is a peer power in terms of technology, in terms of military power, in terms of economy? Will the US view China as an equal partner, or will US view China as a country somehow we need to slow their innovation, as said by one US official, to slow the pace of Chinese innovation or to slow the Chinese growth. It's really a big choice for Washington too.
Yeah. John?
So, yeah, great points, Chindu. Thank you. And thank you, Maz, for hosting this. This is a really interesting discussion. I want to go back to your point about the trade war launched by Trump. It didn't happen in a vacuum, okay? Trump was responding to very strong domestic political stimulus, which was the Rust Belt and the sense of technological espionage on an industrial scale, where many of the items of technology in China appear to look remarkably like technology that was, originally designed or built in the United States. There was a sense, and perception is reality, let's face it, there is a sense of grievance in the United States that China joined the WTO and then played the United States, tricked the United States. And this is something that Trump really tapped into. And Biden, I think, is really struggling to deal with as well. And I think that's an important point to note. I would also make the point about China, it talks about the center of humiliation, and it likes to stress that. I'm just thinking, can we not move on? I get that, it was terrible what happened. Japan has tried to make amends. I think the world is a different place. I mean, even Australia, it was only 1967 that we got rid of the white Australia policy, It was very, very racist. Australia today, in policy terms, is not. It is a very multicultural country. A quarter of our population is migrants. And about a good half of that is are from Asia, from Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. I mean, it's a very diverse country. It's a very inclusive and welcoming country now. And so to harp on about the center of humiliation, it's like it's an anachronistic concept. No one is contemplating taking the kind of racist policies that were in the case that Australia was founded on 120 years ago. That we're a long way away from that.
But John, just on that point, though, I mean, isn't that the very issue that, say, Australia is trying to reconcile with its indigenous population? It's about not acknowledging history and the past, which is obviously, But
many of us are, man. You look at what's happening. State governments are looking to develop treaties. There's some denial in parts of the population, but this is diffuse governance. We have 8 state and territory governments, we have a federal government, we have different parties, and in that mix is a mixture of views that's bubbling up. So that treaties are emerging. There's a lot of debate, a lot of contestation, which I think is really healthy, and far more acknowledgement of this than ever before. I as a kid, I grew up, never heard these stories. Now I have a much greater awareness.
Well, are we do the same? Should we, as a world, do the same for
be more
like
open
China?
and more understanding about our past? Yes, I think there was a couple of things. I think I'm a big fan of Karl Popper and his book The Open Society and Its Enemies, and I'm concerned that China is increasingly a closed society. We've seen the Great Firewall of China emerge. When Bill Clinton was president of the United States, he saw the internet as this liberating, equalizing, empowering of democracy and freedom of political expression that has been completely reversed in the case of China and other countries that have sought to emulate its approach to the use of technology to control the state. And I think that's a shame. And it's reinforced this fear of not a democracy, because democracies, as they say, don't go to war against each other, but of an authoritarian state that is run away from democracy, that has tried to reinforce authoritarianism under President Xi in particular, that is generating a pushback and a fear in particularly countries like the United States, which, let's not forget, the United States is a particularly warlike country. It conducted a civil war where Americans killed Americans in the hundreds of thousands. And it is a war that is still deeply engaging for Americans to this day. It is a country that is, it's built up its military capabilities. It's got an armed force that is an incredibly expensive hammer looking for a nail, Now, China has been very clever so far about refusing to present a nail. In the South China Sea, in its, grey zone operations, in its application of warfare diplomacy, it's assiduously avoided presenting a nail. But I would contend that America's nervousness, its unease about its place in the world, makes the military option more attractive than ever. And I think that is something China has a role to play in allaying the concerns that are generating momentum for that as an option. Now, Van Jackson, an academic American guy in New Zealand at the moment, has talked about American foreign policy being misguided and being overly emphasizing the military solution. I think he's right. And America is afraid that its economic prowess is waning. Relatively speaking, it feels the economic lever is not as strong and therefore is clutching onto the military one greater than ever. China has a role to play here in allaying its concerns. And it needs to, I think, to be looking to the future, not just about, the great rejuvenation or the ending of the century of the humiliation, ending the centenary of that, being a key milestone for China's coming out. China's already come out. It came out in 2008. With the Olympic Games, the global financial crisis, how much assurance do you need? You're going to get it again with the Olympics next year, the Winter Olympics. Let's now be the bigger party. Now let's take the chip off our shoulders and be the great power, the magnanimous great power, and start doing what Teddy Roosevelt did, which is the great, this is one of the great lines of American presidents. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. Speak softly, China. Come on. You can do it. You don't need to be speaking loudly anymore. You're already a great power, Stop spreading fear. Stop scaring the horses. Change your ways a bit. Just be a little bit softer.
Chindu, your response to that?
That's an interesting comment from John. Let me respond a little bit about this. In the Western parlay, people describe that as a victimhood, psychology of the Chinese side. People say, there's a good side, probably bad side too. And I would say within China, there's also discussion, we need to move on. And because we are a big power now, at least the GDP, and also the size, the history, this is a big country. And we should see ourselves in a more in a way, not only within China, but also from outside China in a more objective, more balanced way. We have a responsibility for the peace and the stability of this region and of this world. Let me give you a couple of examples, of China, what China is doing. China and the U.S. view differently about the UN, for example. China is the second contributor to the UN budget, as it should be. And China is the second contributor to the peacekeeping operation fees, as it should be. And also China is the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the big five, the UN Security Council members, the 5 members. China provides the largest number of peacekeepers. If you plus that with this standby, police force, China is actually the largest contributor to peacekeepers to the UN. So China, see that, that's my role to play. I want to contribute to peacekeeping, and China is doing that. And I'll give you another example of China is moving ahead. For example, people, as we said, you can always find a problem with China. You can always criticize this and that. But there are also on the other side. For example, Xi Jinping promised these goals, 2030, 2060. Peaking of carbon emission and also neutrality. That's a big promise. That's a promise actually surprised the world as well as the Chinese audience. There are complaints actually inside China saying that the president making such a promise, as a big promise, as a developing country, we have a long way to go. And then, you noticed this, the people call it shortage of power. In China, some of the factories were asked, to operate only 3 days a week or 4 days a week because of the lack of electricity. That's partly because of the quota. Every province, you have a quota to produce the emissions, and you are not allowed to emit carbon dioxide, beyond that quota amount. So you see, there's a strict implementation of the climate change promises of China. Do you see that as a responsible behavior, or do you see that as irresponsible behavior? I would say China is trying to be very hard to be responsible in terms of climate change. If China wants to be a spoiler of the world, China can say, we are a developing country. Sorry, we cannot do that. Nobody expects China to reach neutrality in 2060. Of course, China is smart in terms of the renewable energy. China is the biggest investor. China sees that as another revolution. China basically thinks, we should do big in that respect. That's good to the world. That's good to China too. If you look at the installation and export of this solar panels, of EVs, of the batteries, I think also wind turbines. China is basically the largest around the world. 1/3 of this renewable technology or patents comes from China. When people say, China probably in the past copied, technologies from the US, from other developed world, but also I would say China is investing in that respect to be more innovative and to be more productive. Let me also respond a little bit to this about Trump's trade war with China. John mentioned that. I agree with John. Because of the domestic concern, the Rust Belt, the U.S. side. When I was in the United States as a correspondent, Chinese ambassador basically told us, to also write about stories about the U.S. difficulties, so the Chinese audience would have a better understanding of the U.S. difficulty, because the U.S. They do have a difficulty. The Chinese side should understand, so we can come to a middle point, a consensus. Like both sides should do something to help resolve the issue, and the issue, unfortunately, probably remains even today. And then the manufacturing, basically, and then I would add to one point, that is globalization. Globalization, outsourcing, the multinational companies. Naturally, they would do outsourcing because that gives them more competitive edge with cheaper labor and even cheaper source, for example. So they found China to be a good destination. And now today, Vietnam too. I would say that's a natural development, course of development of big business, unfortunately. If you look at China, there's also concern nowadays. Companies migrating to Vietnam, Bangladesh, because labors are cheaper. So that's naturally Chinese companies would move to Vietnam. Not only about the foreign companies, Chinese company would move to Vietnam, Bangladesh. What can you do? You cannot say, no, you cannot move. You can only increase your competitive edge by providing, for example, I have robots probably. I have, a better policy, for example. I can give you more incentive to stay and to hire my workers and to contribute to the economy. I would say, unfortunately, for European countries, for the US, the globalization, they don't have a corresponding policy, domestic policy, to mitigate this severe or the adverse, the impact of globalization. That is the impact on their industrialization, on their workers. They don't have such a policy, and then they see the suffering of their people. And then people tend to, politicians tend to point fingers at others instead of themselves, instead of looking at themselves. There's a lack of such policy. And then you see a big issue over there, 2008, 2007, the financial crisis. And then, yes, even today, the US is a bit struggling about that. But, what can we do? But we need to rethink about the issue, what we can do. The US is working hard to draw all the companies back to the US. But of course, if the US provides better policy, investors will go there. For example, the Chinese, the biggest producer of glasses in China, they have a factory in the US. They say the US taxes are very low, very competitive, much lower than the Chinese taxes. So they go to the US. So things like that. I think every country, in a competitive world, they will do what they can do to attract the investors, to attract the business. And simply blame your competitor is not a solution, unfortunately.
Gentlemen, I'm conscious of the time, but John, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time too. Just a couple of maybe some concluding remarks I think is probably worth making. There's a great line from Winston Churchill that said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, apart from all the others." And democracy in Australia is messy, but I think democracy is something. It's a beacon. It's a very attractive proposition for many. Even in authoritarian states, many people really are attracted to the idea of having a say, of their voice counting. And I think, China, maybe that's the next stage of development for China, that it can think about opening up a bit more. But the other thing I'd make the point is that we all have to share this planet, and the point about the environment and needing to be smarter about the way we do business and worried about, climate change and pollution and the degradation, we actually have to make this work. And we really do need to change our perspectives a little bit. Australia, China, the United States, all of us need to change our perspectives and think about the challenges we face that we share. And I think there is some effort that the COP26 is part of that. It's a pity that President Xi is not going to be there. President Putin's not going to be there as well. I think that's a real shame. I think it's really important that all of us recognize that there are some higher order issues that we share. And that should be, that's about self-interest. It should drive a rethink in Australia and China and elsewhere about our relationship, how we manage our relationships, how we manage priorities. And you touched on before about the United Nations. China is already a very dominant player in the United Nations. It's a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council. It's got senior appointments in many of the UN-related bodies. The United States has a big stake in this. We all have a stake in this. We need to make it work. And if we look at it as a zero-sum game, then we will see conflict. We've got to stop seeing it zero-sum. We've got to see it as something we all have to share in and find a happy medium in. And hopefully, we can. I look back when I first started at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. talking and writing about the positive dimensions of the relationship between China and Australia and the opportunities for defence-to-defence talks and increased collaboration. It would be nice if we could get back to that. I don't think that that's too optimistic or too naive on my part to see as being possible, but there is some change that needs to happen. There's a degree of humility required by people who should be more self-confident, countries that should be more self-confident about their place in the world, and the need to look above their own position and see the spectrum of challenges we face: governance challenges, environmental challenges, and great power contestation and sharing. So thank you, Chindu, and thank you, Maz.
Chindu, your closing remarks, any final comments?
Thank you, John. I largely agree with John. I think absolutely we should give up this zero-sum, mentality or the perception of the world. Really, we need cooperation to deal with our common challenge. For example, climate change. We know that climate change is a big threat to Australia, to China, to the US, to every country in the world. And also this pandemic. It's a pity to not to see cooperation or more cooperation between China and the US. These biggest two countries, they should do more to work together to help save the world. Unfortunately, because of politics, that's not the case. And also, I would describe, we do have democracies in the West, although democracies, varies from country to country. In China, every country, I would say, there is a certain degree of democracy, certain degree of authoritarian. Otherwise, you wouldn't run as a government, and that's a fact. In China, I would describe the Chinese system as a centralized system. If you look at Chinese history, as long as there's a strong central government, there's stability, there's prosperity. If the central government is weak, and then you would see warlords, you would see chaos. Unfortunately, the Chinese are very sensitive to that. So system-wise, it probably will remain the same. But of course, China can afford to be more open and to be more closely engaged with the rest of the world, in particular, rich Western countries. And I think we should come together to talk to each other more about, our concerns, our understanding, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes not accurate. In that sense, because nobody is seeking war, nobody is seeking conflicts, nobody is seeking disputes. I think we should pay less and less attention to military operations and more attention to cooperation in research and development, in investment, in trade, in people-to-people communication, in bringing our diplomats face-to-face to talk to each other, like us. I would say a lot of a problem would be probably easier to be resolved.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot more diplomacy that's required. And in fact, I was hoping to get to questions to explore opportunities of mutual benefit between China and the West at large, and climate change was certainly going to be one of those topics. So I hope to invite you both again in the future to join me for another one of these, because I think this is exactly, as you both have highlighted, this is what we need. We need some more dialogue, some more perspective taking off the other side. So on that note, gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me so much of your time today. And I know we've gone well over our originally agreed time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maz. Thank you,
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.